Welcome to the Morgenthaus A Family of Mother. You may be wondering why the Morgenthaus matter, for many reasons. It came to matter to me when I read a play about another American Jewish family living in Georgia. I thought, why not a piece about the Morgenthaus? I don't know much about them, but I soon discovered they were extremely interesting people who did important things. Yet that wasn't what most attracted me to them. Not the primary reason I didn't like it. Nor was it they pursued the American dream, although they certainly were about that. But rather they've been practitioners of what has been called the American civic religion. The belief in the sanctity of democracy, independence, equality, and community, and they're acting on that belief. The patriarch, Henry Morgenthau Sr., the lifelong reading and honor the Ralph Waldo Emerson, who in his concord hymn delivered at the 50th anniversary of the start of the American Revolution against the tyranny of the king, wrote, "Once seated in that flame of spirit, and fired the shot all around the world." Lately, the echo of that shot has been fading. And I hope the learning about 3 generations of Morgenthaus will believe in and sometimes risk their lives for the American civic religion will amplify that fading echo. That's the reason why I'm writing the other accomplishments with the Morgenthaus matter. On a more personal note, once I started writing, I remember hiking the Northfield Plaza Trail in the Adirondacks and going past Blue Mountain Lake. Jews were not welcome in the spectacular lobby or even the more ordinary hotel of the Adirondacks at that time, if they were restricted. The practice would continue to go after World War II. So the Jews developed their own resort around Blue Mountain Lake, and the Morgenthaus had a home there. Later, I kayaked down the Concord River under the North Bridge and climbed the bank to view the Worcester, France famous statue of the Minuteman, with Emerson's words carved on its pedestal. It was a moving experience. Here is Michael to tell us about the unlikely life of Henry Morgenthau Sr.
Thanks, Jerry. My name is Michael Cassandra. Just on a technical note, I've been speaking with certain telephones on, just silence. So imagine a 10-year-old boy, that you're a 10-year-old Jewish boy named Henry Morgenthau. And we're going to call Henry here Henry Sr. to distinguish him from the next story, Henry Jr. He left his big, beautiful home in the center of the German town of Mannheim, sailing to a foreign land called America with his mother and his father, and 10 siblings. And they're arriving in an enormous and crowded city of New York in 1866. We're going back pretty far. America, that fascinating place. He had overheard his father, Lazarus, talk about when he spoke about his business. His father's business was manufacturing cigars in busy factories in Mannheim and selling them in that faraway place, America. Henry's father had, in fact, made the family a huge fortune exporting those luxury cigars to gold diggers in the California gold rush. But the reason they left Mannheim and were now in the United States was because there was a civil war in the United States. And during the Civil War, Lincoln and the government imposed stiff tariffs on imported goods. Access to the American market then was closed to Lazarus's cigar, which collapsed. Secretly broke, Henry's father abandoned Mannheim, sold a house, and left New York. Young Henry Sr.'s family life in the big city was a roller coaster. His father Lazarus had purchased and ran a German brass company The Rathskeller, for those who don't know, is in the basement near Paul, which did good business. So the family was able to move from the working class housing of the docks of Brooklyn up to Manhattan's Upper West Side, a neighborhood that was affluent to extremely wealthy German Jewish families known as our crowd. The Lazarus Morgenthau family was never accepted as part of it. But just being on its fringes allowed Henry Sr. to get to know many people who would become important later on in his business. Henry Sr., the immigrant child, benefited hugely from the developing public school system in New York City, becoming an outstanding student. Sadly, though, at the same time, his father became mentally unstable. The business suffered, and the father became a con man of sorts, promoting something called the Golden Book, which was empty of any content, but purported to guarantee success to those who bought it and signed their names. Teenage Henry was witness to his father's behavior as it became more and more erratic. The family several times did what we call today an intervention, sending him to a restaurant where the uptown German Jews sent their most troubled relatives. The financial insecurity that accompanied his father's mental instability had a strong impact on how Henry Sr. was to conduct his life. Henry Sr. reacted to his father's growing situation by becoming his father's antithesis. Consciously or unconsciously, he became highly, even rigidly so. And he kept this trait of high organization throughout his life. Another driving force in Henry Sr.'s psychological makeup was the quest for self-improvement. Already as a young teen, he became a founding member of a group of boys who met weekly, among other things, to read and discuss American thinkers and writers. He developed a lifelong fascination with the works of Benjamin Franklin and Ralph Waldo Emerson, as was mentioned. He read and reread Ben Franklin's autobiography and modeled himself in Poor Richard. Going to bed early to rise makes a man theoretically and wise has become pretty trite today. But teenage Henry, at that time, applied the lesson diligently. He started each day, even as a teenager, drawing up a list of the things that had to be accomplished that day. And he graded himself on what he had accomplished today. Henry knew that Ben Franklin had made enough money to retire in his 40s, and that made Franklin's advice on life even more attractive to Henry Sr. At a deeper, Franklin's belief that the best worship of God is benevolence to our fellow man reinforced an already nascent boy Henry. Performing public service should be the apex of one's career, that we shall see. From Emerson, Henry Sr. found a great deal he could identify with, especially Emerson's notion of an oversoul, and his belief in the unspecifiable, non-denominational, transcendent spirituality. Although he wasn't aware of it at an early age, Emerson's ideas did find resonance in Henry's maturing spiritual beliefs for the rest of his life. Along with some sentiments of Emerson and Franklin, Henry Sr. had to deal with often rugged realities of everyday life. At the young age of 14, he had to go to work as a messenger for a prestigious law firm using the connections his father had made out proud. He took full advantage of the need to drop out of school at that time to learn the trade of equity management, which you will see as back in school, his father also made him drop out of City College for lacking money. Eventually, he paid his own way and graduated. And then he went on to Columbia Law School. At Columbia Law School, he did very, very well. And upon graduation, he got two of his new buddies, and they formed a law firm. He wrote in his autobiography that in the beginning, he and his partners were barely able to pay the rent. But within a few years, their small firm was making substantial amounts of money. Henry Sr. acknowledged that his connections without crowd brought in affluent clients. But he also knew that the legal talent and skill that he and his partners had kept the clients with him. By the time Henry was just 30, he was, if not fabulously rich, very comfortable. One of the things that he decided he needed to do was he was still afraid that his father's illness could injure his mother. He bought her a house in Holland to get her out of the way of Lazarus. Even then, Henry was not sure about his father's state and decided his mother needed even more distance from her. He and the family eventually sent her off to Chicago. At that age also, in his over methodical way, Henry decided it was time to apply. And that would have been a word he would have used, a wife. He drew up a list of possible candidates and recorded their assets on side, liabilities on the other side. But his calculations got totally messed up because he actually fell. We had a young woman named Josephine Sykes, who happened to be also one of the heirs of the family that made a fortune in the street. After months of carefully strategizing in the pursuit of Josephine accepted the proposal. He was elated until Josie's mother said, never. There was insanity in the family. To complicate things even a little bit further, Henry was a father who were enormously wealthy. Crushed but not despairing, Henry planned something close to a military campaign, enlisting friends and family to convince Mrs. Sykes to agree to the marriage. It took a while, but she finally did consent. The wedding date was set when Henry, who took no chance, it occurred to him that his father was unpredictable enough to crash the wedding and ruin the day. So he engaged Pinkerton's detective agency and followed his father, just in case, to bring him to arrest him if he had any ideas about crashing. So it started out as an exercise in accounting liabilities and assets, ledgers and all, ended up in many happy years of marriage. Henry went into the real estate business, as I mentioned earlier. It helped out when he did his training as a teenager in the law firm. He went to the real estate business and did very well. The New York State subway system at that point was just being built. Henry bought land near the end of each projected line, principally in Washington Heights, the Bronx, where he built apartment houses and then turned them over at great profit. A special note, he sold an empty lot to a friend who owned the then struggling New York Times. That lot became known as Times Square. Henry Sr. was responsible for much of the most notable real estate development in the ever-expanding Manhattan at that time. Like his model Ben Franklin, Henry Sr. retired early. He told his son, Henry Jr., here, not to wait until he was 50 to devote himself to public service. Public service, he preached, was the most worthwhile way to spend one's life. While in New York, two men became major influences in Henry Sr.'s life. One was Rabbi Stephen Wise, and the other was Woodrow Wilson. Wise was a charismatic rabbi, a brilliant, spellbinding speaker, and a believer in the social gospel. An ideology for him was more theology that Wise imported from his Christian friends. The social gospel had much in common with Franklin's notion that helping one's fellow human beings was the true worship of God. It also corresponded well with the Jewish notion of tikkun olam. The social gospel was also overtly political, strongly backing progressive causes and lobbying for progressive legislation, things that Henry Sr. supported a great deal including such as child labor laws, were very important in those days. Henry Sr. was not particularly religious. He had joined Temple Mount, attended services from time to time. Wise was a bit of fight with Temple Mount, soon leading to form what he called free in one sense, that the best seats could not be sold to the wealthy. In another sense, that the rabbi had complete freedom to advocate. Strongly attracted to Wise's charisma and ideas, he provided the money and lots of money for Wise to have his free cinema. And he became his chief financial support for many years. When Rabbi Wise met Theodore Herzl and became a passionate scientist, Henry wanted no politics, saying about America with migrants, and that the idea of a Jewish state in Palestine was based. Henry left the Free Cinema, and the two men didn't speak until Wise did attend his friend's funeral much later. Ironically, Henry Sr. met Woodrow Wilson, who was at that time president of Princeton University, at a dinner celebrating the anniversary of Wise's Free Cinema. Wilson lacked White's magnetism, but Henry was attracted by Wilson's brilliance and devotion to progressive politics. Also, Wilson was a Palestinian figure and would use positively to describe a person who is not Jewish, but who is an admirer of achievements and culture of people of Jewish faith. As university president, in fact, Wilson had appointed Princeton's first Jewish professor. Just to make it a sort of footnote, when Wilson was president of the United States, he appointed Louis Brandeis as the first Jewish member. Wilson began his campaign for the government of New Jersey in 1911, and Henry Sr. became his main contributor. Wilson won the campaign, and the close relationship between Henry Sr. and Woodrow Wilson was sealed. From their very first meeting, Henry Sr. felt that Wilson could be a possible future president of the country. He persuaded a reluctant Wilson to run for the office, and he contributed vast sums of his own money, multiplying that great fundraising. Wilson became president in 1913, and he acknowledged openly that he would not be president if it weren't for Henry Sr.'s support. Henry Sr. expected to be offered a high-level cabinet post. When he wasn't, he was deeply hurt and angry. Instead, Wilson offered him the ambassadorship to the island, a post that had been held by a succession of Jews. He turned Wilson's offer down for that very reason. Wilson approached Henry Sr. again, telling him, there are many other Jews I've appointed, but I wanted you. I needed you in Constantinople so I could protect the Jewish settlers in Palestine. And Istanbul is a vital center of world thought. I need not only a Jew, but a man of your talents. Please read this. Henry Sr. still hesitated. Wilson then told him, I don't want to send you as a Jewish ambassador. I'm sending you as a United States ambassador. Henry accepted. He took up his assignment in the turbulent pre-war period of 1913 and 1916. En route to his post, Ambassador Morgenthau stopped in Hamburg. He was shocked. This wasn't the Germany he remembered from his childhood. The Gemütlichkeit, or conviviality, was formed of his family's Ratsherr. He witnessed a new nationalism, openly expressed belief in German racial superiority, and a new aggressiveness, manifesting the arms race with other major powers, and a rampant domestic militarism. Ambassador Morgenthau concluded correctly that the Kaiser was preparing for a war that he wished to initiate, create a German empire that would span Europe. As ambassador, Henry Sr. was initially dazzled by the Ottoman capital with its exotic architecture, endless rounds of diplomatic receptions, dances, dinners, and entertainments of all sorts. As the representative of the United States, he was first among equals. He was courted by ambassadors of countries that were centuries old. Constantinople was also an underground city of shadows, intrigue, between spies, agents, conspirators. It was enough to turn anyone's head, unless you were in the scene. The Ottoman Empire had undergone a revolution just a few years earlier, led by the Young Turks, headed by a man named Talat Pasha, who promised an end to the tyranny of the existing Turkish government, replacing it with democracy, free press, free elections, the reduction of the Sultan to a figurehead, and a modern economy. The Young Turks wanted to bring Turkey into the 20th century. Henry, as ambassador, developed a close relationship. Ambassador Morgenthau was being supported also by the German ambassador, who was trying to keep the United States neutral. As a side note, Talat Pasha warmly received, this may be familiar to some, a notable visitor in the person of Henry's granddaughter, who was just a child, but who grew up to be Morgenthau, authoring the definitive account of the open August. In his cultivation of Ambassador Morgenthau, Talat Pasha arranged a trip for him to Palestine. The trip played a major part in Henry Sr.'s reversing course and becoming a strong supporter of science. Ambassador Morgenthau's initial close relationship with Talat Pasha came to an end as the reports of mass destruction, mass deportation, and torture of Turkey's king was tested. It didn't take long for Turkey to go from relocation and torture to mass movement. Talat Pasha first explained to Henry that the relocations were military necessities. Then he said the outside. And then he said the Armenians would destroy the Turks. And then finally he told Pasha told Morgenthau this was an internal Turkish matter. The ambassador needed to stay out of it. That was the end of any trust. The mass murder of the Armenians became the first relevant offense. So, Henry, as ambassador, did all he could to stop the slaughter. He appealed to his friend, the German ambassador, to use his influence to stop the killing. At that point, Germany was held. Ran Turkey with officers in town. But the German ambassador refused. I'm going to jump ahead a bit. When Hitler was told that he couldn't carry out the final solution because world opinion would turn against Germany, Hitler quickly remembers the Armenians. But then more than a dozen European countries had closed their embassies in Constantinople, and Ambassador Morgenthau was asked to represent the power. That arrangement lasted until the American War. But Henry still had a nominal relationship with Pasha's colleague. He continued to appeal to Talat Pasha's self-interest, whatever humanity he might have to stop the genocides. His plea were met with stern silence. The ambassador had no more success with his own statement. US. The tragic future parallel what would happen. Wilson's first stage, who was the twice defeated Democratic candidate, President William Jennings Bryan, was a strict business. He ordered his ambassador to do nothing to offend any of the continuing European powers. For his part, President Wilson had run for re-election on a platform being too proud to fight. And despite the ongoing German provocation with submarines sinking American ships, Ambassador Morgenthau was still urged to saying nothing about Turkey's massive moves. Fear that Turkey would be doing its ally. Henry was aware that Wilson, who had just commanded deep for his first fight, was preoccupied with the second Edith Galt, and that he oscillated between preparing for war and his determination to stay out of the war. So it was unlikely that Wilson would agree to interfere in defense. So Henry resigned. He returned to America. He proceeded to write a bestseller, That's the Morgenthau Story. Was greeted with much praise, but unfortunately for him, had no offense in jokes. As a civilian, Henry Sr. did everything he could to help the Armenian survivors who were now refugees scattered. Those goods. But nothing he did had an effect on the ongoing events. This failure haunted Henry Sr. When the war ended, Wilson brought a gospel to keeps the 5 minutes. Even after he resigned. With him to the peace talks at Versailles, where he met many pro-Zionist delegates who completed his conversion to Zionism. Henry Sr., by the way, hated to be called Henry Sr. In the last decade of his life, everyone he dealt with ceded to his wishes and fault. After the war in 1919, Wilson sent Uncle Henry, so unfortunately noted their advice, head of delegation to investigate tales of persecution of Jews. The Poles treated him to a Potemkin village tour of the country, a misleading facade of happy village, and managed to convince the naive, in this case, or believe American that the talk of anti-Jewish activity was Ambassador Morgenthau authored a report for which he was widely and soundly criticized for having whitewashed his treatment of Jews. Henry's blind eye was surely influenced by his own contemptuous attitude to Jews and his disdain for Orthodox Jews, which most of the Jews. In the next 2 decades, Morgenthau Sr. became renowned for his generosity to Jewish and non-Jewish organizations, and he became known as a gentle philosopher of reads. By then, he strongly supported Zionist organizations with substantial donations. Near the end of his life, Henry Sr., in a published interview, quoted the words in Shakespeare's play, spoken by the Lord Chancellor Bowles, who was the advisor to him. Bowles, he said, I wish I had served my God with as much zeal as I had served my king. When asked by the interviewer who was his king, Morgenthau replied, materialism. But then he quickly added, most valuable things in life, spiritual. Uncle Henry died in his 90s, in 1946. His library was packed with the works of Franklin and Emerson. He had been consumed over the rise of fascism in Germany, yet he was satisfied, he himself, to live a life through his spiritual values, and those values that he shows in his development.
My name is Tom Byrne. I'm going to be telling you about Henry Morgenthau Jr. Henry was born in 1891 in Manhattan's Upper West Side, as noted, into considerable wealth. Excuse me. His father had built much of the city of north of Midtown and still had extensive real estate holdings. They had 6 living servants and a full-time shift floor. Unlike his father, Jr. didn't attend excellent public schools. Instead, he attended the private white school, where all his classmates were from the very top level of the highly successful German Jewish aristocracy. Most were third-generation Americans. Junior, who craved his father's approval all his life, barely passed his courses. One of 6 children, and being the only boy, Junior was sure his father had in fact, the highest expectations of him, and that he had let them down. Although Henry Sr. never criticized his son, Junior was almost certainly right. Papa had arranged for him to enter Exeter, an exclusive boarding school. He was probably the only Jewish student. Exeter proved a disaster, academically and socially. His letters home are heartbreaking, begging his parents to let him leave and come home. In those letters, Henry writes that he has no friends, often begging for news from his frequently traveling parents who are seemingly blind to the desperation of their needy son. Finally, Henry Sr. and Exeter's headmaster agreed that Junior should not return after the summer break. Returning to the Dwight School, he went into what today would be regarded as a depression, finally finishing the courses but never receiving a diploma. Papa wanted Henry to study architecture after Exeter so he could design buildings Papa would erect and manage. So Junior enrolled in Cornell University's School of Architecture. He soon flunked out, dashing his dreams of being in a partnership with his beloved Papa. At that moment, Henry Jr.'s health began to fail, most likely suffering a psychosomatic illness. The family sent him off to a ranch in Texas, the first ranch, to recover. And recover he did. Instead of writing depressed and depressing letters about how he had tried so hard, but nevertheless had let Papa down once again with yet another failure. Now his letters were filled with joy. Papa, I have my own horse and ride every day. It is beautiful. Returning east, Henry enrolled in the Cascadia School to prepare for another shot at Cornell, this time in the School of Agriculture. It was certainly a better fit than architecture. Unfortunately, once again, he failed. School just wasn't for him. Papa arranged a cross-country trip with Carl Scrolfleet, who managed the Morgenthau farm in Fishkill, New York. The trip was transformative. Henry couldn't learn in the classroom, but he sure could, visiting every kind of farm, learning about crops and how to raise them, about cows, the ponds, about the market and the hardships, as well as the joys of farming. Henry wrote home that he had discovered what he was, that he was a farmer. He found an identity, profession, an anchor in the world. The rest of his life, when he had to declare his profession on forms, say his tax return, and Henry always put farmer. How could this obviously bright, capable young man fail so many times? When Henry was growing up, nobody knew of such thing but reading. Henry was dyslexic. He had a learning disability before he even had a name. All his life, Henry had difficulty reading and often as well concentrating. Even when he was Secretary of the Treasury, responsible for millions of dollars, he suffered psychosomatic illnesses undoubtedly triggered by his learning disability. He suffered from headaches, probably migraines, that were linked to his struggles with dyslexia. Had there been anyone with knowledge of dyslexia during Henry's lifetime, he wouldn't have had to torture himself with the certainty that he'd let Papa down, and that Papa was certainly disappointed in him. It would be years before he was free, if he ever was, of guilt or disappointment. Henry's undiagnosed, untreated dyslexia affected every aspect of his life, not just his academic and achievement. His shyness and discomfort around people was certainly one consequence. No wonder he was more comfortable with plants and animals. When his father became United States ambassador to Turkey, he twice called on his teenage son to cross the ocean and act as his assistant. At last, Henry's dream of being his father's partner was fulfilled, as it increasingly was on the family's Fishkill farm. His father bankrolled Junior when he wanted to plant acres and acres of apple trees, when he wanted to acquire a herd of cattle. Henry was close to all of the creatures on his farms, especially Old Dutch, the farm's prize-winning breeding bull. Now feeling that he was living up to Papa's expectations, Henry's depression was lifted as he not only found a vocation, but also an identity. He knew who he was. Henry became more social, even attending meetings at the Grange. Surprisingly, he was elected sheriff of the agricultural community in Dutchess County. And even more consequently, he met another gentleman farmer, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Henry's relationship with Roosevelt was as consequential as discovering that at heart he was a farmer. By then, Henry was dating, soon seriously dating Eleanor Faulkner, a graduate, gifted amateur actress, and definitely on the mother's side as a layman, member of our crowd. They married, remaining happily so until Eleanor died many years later. Roosevelt, then practicing law with very little interest in it, was considering running for an open seat in the New York State Senate. Fearing that he would be defeated by the heavily Republican upstate farmers, he was about to decline a nomination that could have been his for the asking. Junior, who by then was conversant with the thinking of those farmers, persuaded FDR that he could win if he ran on a platform of paving the dirt roads that made getting crops to market difficult and uncertain, improving rural schools so that they could approximate the quality of the city ones, and reforming the tax system, all geared to the rural population. Franklin listened to Henry and made him his front man, who arranged speaking engagements, recruited local politicians, politicians, and advertised and drew crowds to FDR's rallies. But Henry was more than a frontman. He heavily influenced Roosevelt's policy decisions. Roosevelt won. From then on, right up to his run for his fourth term as president, Henry was not only his friend, he was also his frontman and advisor. After the win, Roosevelt presented Henry with a photograph of the two of them in an open touring car signed to one of two of a kind. His papa's wealth allowed Henry to buy a failing magazine, the American Agriculturalist, putting it on its feet and publishing it for many years. Incidentally, the Fishkill farm almost always lost money. An uncomfortable fact that Henry had by denial. Once again, Papa took care of the deficits. A rising star in the Democratic Party with a magic name and a stellar record as Assistant Secretary of the Navy in World War I, Roosevelt was the party's choice for vice president in 1920. A Republican with a party and running on a platform of quote, return to normalcy, won in a landslide. A year later, Franklin Roosevelt suffered a far more serious loss. He was crippled by polio. As soon as he was well enough to receive visitors, Henry Morgenthau Jr. was at his side, chatting, playing board games, and just being supportive. Roosevelt never gave up the hope of welcoming him. When he told the country years later we had nothing to fear but fear itself during the depths of the Depression, he was echoing what he told himself while flat on his back in 1922. It was not literally true, either personally or politically, yet it was true in some transcendental sense, transformational to both the man and the nation, giving both hope where there was none. In 1924, Roosevelt made a political comeback, giving the nominated speech for Al Smith as president of the Democratic Convention. When Roosevelt called Smith the happy warrior, he brought down the House. 4 years later, FDR ran for governor of New York and won. Once again, Henry was political advisor and frontman. Roosevelt liked to give people nicknames. One day he called Henry to his office and told him, "Henry, you're too damn serious. From now on, I'm going to call you Henry the Morgue." And he did. He also made Henry New York State Commissioner of Conservation, perfect fit for him. Henry was ecstatic. Anticipating the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC of the New Deal, Henry put thousands of unemployed men to work in the forests of New York State. Contrary to what one might expect given his academic failures, Henry turned out to be a terrific administrator. Millions went through his department without a hint of scandal. He proved innovative, creative, and a born leader. There was no one better than Henry Morgenthau at raising money. He proved this during World War II by recruiting Hollywood stars, including Ronald Reagan, to sell war bonds and persuade a reluctant Congress to vote for necessary funds. Once again, he led well and kept a tight rein on the billions that passed through his hands. Perhaps Henry's greatest achievement as Secretary of the Treasury was finding a way to fund England's desperate struggle against Nazi Germany through what he called lend-lease. It was a way of getting around the neutrality laws that prohibited the United States from giving help to Britain or any other combatants. Without the help, Henry had found a way of delivering. Great Britain may very well have fallen to the Nazis. Henry's role was not only financial. He collaborated with FDR in formulating the very concept of lend-lease, which Roosevelt brilliantly got Congress to endorse when in a radio broadcast he asked, "If your neighbor's house was on fire, would you lend him a hose?" The friendship between Franklin and Henry the Morgue extended to their families. Their wives, Eleanor Morgenthau and Eleanor Roosevelt, became close friends, often starting their days by horseback riding together. It wasn't all social. The two wives would have put their stamps on history. After FDR became president, Henry, who played such a large part in his election, expected he would become Secretary of Agriculture. Roosevelt felt he couldn't appoint a New York Jew to that post. Instead, he appointed Henry Wallace, a Christian from Iowa. Henry became Secretary of the Treasury, a position for which he felt unqualified. After Wallace got the post of Secretary of Agriculture, Henry and he worked very smoothly together, a relationship that helped make the New Deal a success. Roosevelt was deeply concerned that a post-war inflation like the runaway one that followed World War I would lead to conflict and the collapse of the economy. He convened the Bretton Woods Economic Conference to look for ways to prevent it. FDR chose Henry to represent the United States. The British were sending John Maynard Keynes, the most famous economist in the world, as their representative, triggering Henry's own insecurities. He told the president that he was unsuitable for the post that he had never had an economics course, in fact, that he didn't even have a high school diploma. Roosevelt would have none of it, laughing at the thought of the self-important stuffed shirt bankers having to listen to Henry the Moor. In the event, Henry and Lord Keynes got along extremely well. They established two institutions, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, which played crucial roles in making possible the post-World War II prosperity. Bretton Woods, so-called for the New Hampshire resort where it was held, was one of FDR's greatest successes, one in which Henry played a key role. Unfortunately, in later years, Morgenthau's deputy, Dexter White, was accused of being a Soviet spy, which he may have been, echoing the same problem his father had during his tenures. Henry, being the insecure warrior that he was, tormented himself for years that the thought of White, who had played a key role at the conference, had duped him. He oscillated between believing that White being a spy was impossible and that he, Henry, had even been more of a fool than he thought. We'll never know which is true, and neither did Henry. As the truth about the Nazis' final solution became known, Henry was obsessed by his powerlessness, his inability to save his fellow Jews. Henry by now had fully embraced his Jewish identity. Not wanting to stand by helplessly while his fellow Jews were being slaughtered, he confronted FDR, whose record of helping the Jews of Europe was mixed at best. Explicitly, Henry demanded the president approve the War Refugee Board, threatening to resign and tell the press why he would resign. FDR finally approved the formation of the board, whose task was to save as many Jews as possible. It was too little, too late. Nevertheless, the board succeeded in rescuing over 400,000, mostly Hungarian Jews. As the war was coming to an end, the Allies differed on what to do with Germany. Henry's contribution became known as the Morgenthau Plan. It proposed deindustrializing Germany, the Ruhr Valley in particular, and turning Germany into a pastoral country of rural villages incapable of waging aggressive war. Both President Roosevelt and General Eisenhower supported the plan. However, when Russia became a threat in the West, the Morgenthau Plan was forgotten, and Germany was rearmed as a barrier against communist Russian expansion. In May 1945, Henry visited his old friend at his retreat in Warm Springs. Roosevelt was with a woman with whom he had had an affair during the First World War, having promised Eleanor never to see her again. There was also a woman artist painting his portrait. Embarrassed, Henry quickly excused himself. Shaken into distraught, not only by the old mistress, even more so by Roosevelt's appearance, he looked dreadful. Henry never saw him again. Roosevelt died of a stroke the next morning. Not long before, Henry lost Eleanor, who had been quite ill for some time. Then FDR's successor, Harry Truman, with whom he didn't get along, fired him. Truman was about to leave for the Potsdam Conference with Churchill and Stalin. He had told the aide, "I'm not taking the Jew boys, meaning Morgenthau or the Rouge, with me to Potsdam." In a short time, Henry lost his best friend, his wife, his place in the world, and his job. Most men would have been crushed. Not Henry. After a period of depression, he became a passionate supporter of Israel. Having been unable to save the Jews of Europe, he was determined to save the Jews of what was to become a refugee survivors of the Holocaust, the state of Israel. Survivor guilt remained, though attenuated by being able to take action then. Touring the United States with Golda Meir, Henry raised incredible amounts of money to buy the arms essential to Israel's survival. There might not be an Israel had it not been for Henry Morgenthau. He continued to have close relationships with Israel's leaders, dancing the horror with Ben Gurion in the streets of Jerusalem. Returning to New York while continuing to support Jewish causes, Henry the Moor became Henry the man about town, revealing a new facet of his personality. He met a flamboyant French widow, Marcel Pouchon Hirsch, at a Hamptons party. Not Norfolk, unfortunately. He married her. Eleanor Roosevelt commented, "Only Henry would feel he had to marry his mistress." He bought a house in France, spending half the year there. As he aged and developed health problems, his wife spent less and less time with him, while he spent more and more time in his farm in Fishkill. He suffered severe hardening of the arteries and had to have a leg amputated. When Henry died, the Jewish organizations he had supported gave their employees the day off to attend his funeral. The crowd at Temple Emmanuel overflowed into the street. His wife made a brief appearance, and he's never seen again.
Hi, I'm Sarah, and I'm going to talk about Robert Bodilaw. He was born in 1919 and he lived in the hundreds and died in 2019. So, Bobby did not suffer from his father's academic difficulties. Attending Deerfield Academy, a prestigious WASP bastion, he succeeded both in the classroom and on the salary. Again, unlike his father, he was at ease socially, forming friendships that endured a lifetime. Bob went on to Amherst College, where he experienced none of the anti-Semitism his brother suffered at Princeton. Lettering in soccer, he became editor of an Amherst yearbook. The dark clouds hanging over his life were not domestic or personal. They were political and historical. They came from the rise of fascism in Germany. Sharing his family's devotion to the American civic religion, the belief in democracy as something sacred, he wrote in the yearbook he edited, quote, "The class of 1941 has the bittersweet satisfaction of knowing it goes out part of an epic. We are among the few who, during the past years, have had the opportunity to learn freely in a country at peace. We, above all others, should have an abiding faith in American democracy and a shared remembrance of Amherst as not only a place filled with pungent memories of youth, but as a place where we learn the values inherent in Western civilization. As the year draws to a close, America stands not far from Armageddon as the class of 1941 prepares to do battle. Morgenthau meant every word of this declaration of faith, desperate to get in the war and quash the rise of the third rank. He cheated on his physical exam to gain entrance into an officer training program. As a result of a botched childhood mastime operation, he was essentially deaf in one ear. Standing outside the examination room, he asked the emerging candidates what they had been asked, instantly memorized their answers, and then repeated them to the examiners. Passed, he completed his naval officer training program, becoming what was then known as the 90-day wonder. He was commissioned as an ensign in the United States Navy. Bob was assigned to a destroyer, the Lansing, on duty in the Mediterranean. Its captor was a heavy drinker. Bob, in many ways still a child, was essentially the one in command. The Lansing, hit by torpedoes, exploded and sank. There was much loss of life. Bob struggled in the freezing room, trying not to inhale the fumes from the leaking fuel bottle. He listened to the screams of the wounded bleeding out of his engine. These were his men. He felt responsible. He could do little as he witnessed one after another going down, sinking in the terrain. He gave his life job to an enlisted man without one, and Bob treaded water until he was rescued by an American destroyer. All the time, witnessing his fellow sailors perishing and intensifying survivors. After a brief period of shore leave, Morgenthau was assigned to another destroyer, Valor, in the Pacific off Okinawa. Valor means farmer in German, so it was somewhat fitting that Bob, who, like his father and grandfather, deeply loved their Fishkill farm, would end up serving and almost dying on the destroyer. The Barrow was part of a fleet supporting the invasion. The Japanese threw everything they had at the invaders, including the terrifying new weapon, the kamikaze pilots, ready to die for their emperor, crashing planes into the enemy ships. Once again, Bob witnessed men for whom he was responsible now, often horrible from burns or wounds gushing blood. Re-traumatized, his sense of failure and guilt. In World War II, the Navy was segregated. According to Navy regulations, blacks on board could only serve as, quote, mess boys, considered incapable of participating in battle. Risking court-martial, Bob brought the mess boys up from the hull onto the deck and gave them a crash course in firing Bauer's formidable guns. The mess boys downed many Japanese planes, playing a vital role in the Bauer survival. These heroes got belated recognition for their skills and heroism in the form of awards and medals. Somehow, on leave from the battles in the Mediterranean and Pacific, Bob met Martha Partridge. Attracted to her charm, beauty, sincerity, and athleticism, he proposed. Unlike many wartime romances, this one worked. At the war's end, he was discharged, a married man with 2 children. He was dropped off with a 60-pound duffel bag at the bottom of his steep hill. He was lucky he didn't come to gap. There was no fanfare, no brass band. Bob was enraged at the way veterans were treated. His words quote like shit. And even later, more enraged at the way the Vietnam War veterans were treated. He fought long and hard for better treatment of veterans, and this became one of Bob's many causes. Happily married with 2 children, like many of his peers, the discharged father Morgenthau was lost. He couldn't get the memories out of his mind. Images of death by drowning, hemorrhaging, burning. While still on the Bauer, he began suffering nightmares. No one had heard of post-traumatic stress disorder. It didn't even have a name, and the VA had nothing to offer. Finally, Bob pulled himself together and enrolled in Yale Law School. When he graduated, he found a mentor, Robert Patterson, who hired him as his personal assistant in Patterson's elite WASP law firm. The 2 were scheduled to fly to a business meeting. Bob was delayed, didn't make the flight. Patterson didn't. But the plane crashed. Patterson died. And that was one trauma too many. For years, Morgenthau wouldn't fly. He would break into a cold sweat and even cast an aircraft. In a Black Depression, he was immobilized until Bobby Kennedy, now United States Attorney General, offered him a job in the Justice Department. Bob accepted, and he quickly got promoted to U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York. As children, he and Bobby Kennedy had played together on the beaches of Cape Cod. Now they have a shared passion, putting the mafia out of business. The mob had expanded from running the usual rackets, gambling, prostitution, smuggling, extortion, to controlling labor unions and legitimate businesses in New York and beyond. Looked upon as an impossible task, the 2 Bobbies were successful beyond their wildest dreams. They broke up most of the mafia families, jailing their leaders for long periods of time. The 2 Bobbies were relaxing together when phone rang. When he answered, he turned white. He had just heard that his brother had been shot. Morgenthau never talked about that either. A few years later, Nixon became president. And when Morgenthau ignored Nixon's attempts to interfere with the workings of the Justice Department, Nixon fired him. Another time. Recruited by the Democratic Party, Morgenthau ran for governor of New York up against the immensely popular Nelson A. Rodgers. Morgenthau lost in a landslide. The fact that he was a terrible speaker certainly did. But a few years later, he ran for a post that he was better suited and Hampton District Attorney. And this time he won, eventually holding that job for 35 years. As a DA, he had the perfect job, going after white-collar criminals as well as mobsters. As he said, how can I jail a kid for selling pot and not pursue criminals walking in the walls of power? And it was Bobby Morgenthau who was the model for the district attorney in the popular series Law and Order. And Stephen Hill was the original actor who played the DA. Consulted with Morgenthau, sort of asked Morgenthau how would she play the role, and Morgenthau said, "I'd be tough." Okay, and that character was pursued, was played, was pretty good. And then Morgenthau asked Hill how much he was being paid. Hill said, "Oh, about $20,000 for each episode." Oh, good. I wanted to have that job when I retired. With a happy marriage, Bob had 5 children. Sadly, one of his children, Nellie, was profoundly developmental. And this was the only shadow in an otherwise blessed life until tragedy struck again. On a gorgeous summer day, playing tennis at the farm, Martha called out and everyone assumed it was a poison. It was cancer. And after years of surgery, agonizing chemotherapy, and radiation, she died. Bob continued to function at a high level at work, but at home it was a different story. He would lock himself in his room, only coming out as children knew. After 5 years, he started dating, but he didn't really connect with them. Then, a young Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter, Lucinda Franks, interviewed him. He came along. And after some hesitation on both sides, they became lovers. The ex-hippie rebel and the establishment district attorney were an unlikely pair. Bob could have put her in jail during her wild years. But against all odds, and against the advice of everyone they knew, they married. And not only were they married, they remained in love with each other for decades. They had 2 children together, one was adopted. And Lucinda wrote an account of her life, her memoir Timeless. It took Bob's children years, Bob's children in his first marriage, years to accept and eventually love Lucinda. Not surprising, since Bob's eldest daughter was barely older than his new wife. Bob had held off asking Lucinda to marry him because he worried it would hurt his children. By then, Bob was a national, even international figure, universally known as Mr. District Attorney. And for all his seriousness, he didn't want to tangle with him. He could also be very good. And Lucinda appreciated his humor, while recognizing that it was also a defense against the emotional pain, fear of closeness. Yet their yin and yang worked well. That is, until they both became ill. He developed a melanoma, she got breast cancer. Sensing their growing apart and hurt by Bob's journey into a protective shell, Lucinda went into psychotherapy. The therapist told her that Bob's emotional remoteness was a symptom of post-traumatic stress disorder. Her diagnosis of breast cancer had reactivated his traumatic loss of first wife Martha with the same disease and caused his traumatic memories of the lancing and the battle to resurface. New traumatic memories activating. After Lucinda confronted him, Bob at last spoke of these long suppressed, emotionally lacerating memories, as well as other. Didn't happen instantly. This psychotherapy, once removed, took quite a while to have any effect. But when it did, Bob emerged from his frozen imprisonment and they reestablished their old magical intimacy. Bob's melanoma was surgically cured, and Lucinda's cancer was apparently cured, although it returned after Bob's death eventually. Bob also went public, writing articles about the still virtually unknown PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, for the Wall Street Journal. And they reached a wide audience. Now there was a positive feedback loop. Bob's articles reached people previously unreachable. And many wrote back to him, peeling more layers of scabs off of his hands. Always highly functional, professional, Bob now became more emotionally present. Lucinda spoke to him about the solace she had gotten from Jesus as a child, and sometimes still did. He had no such solace. Sharing the comfort she derived from prayer and belief in Jesus, she told Bob, "You've been a trustee of Temple Emmanuel for decades. You raised the money to build a museum of the Jewish heritage, yet you get no comfort, no solace from Judaism. For you, it's not spiritual. It's just public service." He remained silent, she went. It's the Holocaust, isn't it? You can't believe the magnificent God who interferes in human affairs, can't you? Bob answered, "Oh, not." But perhaps the door wasn't as closed as he thought. Within a few years, they climbed Mount Sinai together, holding hands. And Bob became very moved and very sad. But then again, started to close up emotionally and he commented, "Moses' epiphany, however spiritual, was an advance in human consciousness and in the law." "I'm a lawyer, you know." Squeezing his hand harder, and Cindy replied, "Yes, Jewish lawyer." "Bob, let's finish the climb in silence." He nodded in agreement. Bob had herds of admirers, but he also had bitter and sometimes powerful enemies. It was well known that Bob Morgenthau was dangerous. His toughness was manifest far back as Amherst when he wrote his class fighting fascism. He had fought Nazis, Japanese aggressors, child molesters, corrupt politicians, dishonored bankers, international affairs, intriguers, and dangerous conspirators. Usually he won, though not always. He indicted Roy Cohn 3 times without conviction. Bob was accused of having a personal vendetta against him, for which he was widely criticized. Endowing renowned President advisor Clark Clifford didn't go anywhere. Morgenthau did get a conviction when 5 Black teenagers were accused of raping the white jogger and women's killing in Central. Known as the Central Park 5, they spent their youth in prison. They had spent their youth in prison until finally another man confessed to the crime. Bob would characterize the prosecution of the 5 as, quote, "fuck up from beginning to end." He moved for a reversal of the conviction, and he agreed to a multi-million-dollar settlement. He took full responsibility for this miscarriage of justice. Nevertheless, his most steadfast admirers turned on him. Suddenly, Ed Koch, among others, didn't take his phone calls, and the New York Times fell out of love with him, loudly advertising the great guy, its editorial. His stain never entirely vanished, yet Bob continued to be reelected. He held his job until he was 90. Bob revered his father. When the Morgenthau plan was derided as Jewish revenge, he bristled, defending it as a perfectly rational plan to prevent Germany from ever being in a position to inflict the pain and horror that it had in 2 world wars, and pain and horror not only Jews. Although Bob was perfectly at ease with the Jewish desire for revenge, that did not motivate him more. The plan sought not revenge, but justice. And Bob was equally adamant in defending family friend Franklin Roosevelt from charges that he had not done enough to protect the Jews. Morgenthau's reply was an unfailingly curt, "We have a war to fight," effectively ending the conversation. Bob was briefly friendly with Donald Trump, who contributed to his favorite charity, Police Athletic. How? A program to reach impoverished adolescents who were in danger of becoming delinquent. It was highly successful. Well into his 60s, the prominent district attorney, Robert Morgenthau, could be seen playing stickball in the streets of Manhattan with pal kids. Trump also contributed to the building of the Museum of Jewish Heritage. When Bob figured out that Trump was looking to influence the work of the D6, the friendship stopped. Later, when Morgenthau was interviewed by a new generation of Times reporters at the end of his life, they asked him, "So, what are you most afraid of?" Done. He died in 2019. After Bob retired at 90, he insisted that he loved retirement. Lucinda knew better. In fact, he fell into a depression, much like the earlier ones that he'd gone through. He became withdrawn, emotionally flat. Lucinda confronted him. What, retiring? So, do something. Did. He went to work for an elite law firm as full of counsel, meaning that he had an office, a secretary, and he could do as he pleased, as long as he was available to give advice. And he worked there another 10 years, going into the office every day until a few days before he died. During these 10 years, he supported many causes, not only better care for veterans and support of Israel, but also to end the death. By the way, he had taken out a full-page ad and it's demanding. As a way of making amends for his withdrawn sullenness after retirement, Bob, notoriously tight with money, brought Lucinda a bright red convertible sports car. It was a gesture that was enormously successful. She loved that. She wrote in her memoir, "I prayed to die before Bob. I couldn't stand the thought of being without him." When Bob did die, just short of 100, Temple Emmanuel was filled with the rich and not so rich, with the famous and the not so famous. Interestingly, the Kaddish, the Jewish prayer for the dead, which says nothing about death, but instead repeatedly praises God, is not so. I don't know why, Jerry says, but my fantasy is that Bob didn't want to be remembered as praising the God he probably didn't believe in, never having forgiven him for standing by 6 years.